All right, welcome, OLab friends. This is your invisible voice in the sky, Avenel Wing, bringing you a conversation about Chicana feminism and how it affects role play and the study of role play with Dr. Jess Hammer and Rejo Reta. I'm going to turn the mic over to Jess so that they can introduce themselves.
Okay. Hi, folks. I'm Jessica Hammer. You may remember me if you've tuned in for previous broadcasts. I'm the director of the OLab and a professor at Carnegie Mellon University. I research games, I teach game design, and I make games. But today I'm here as much in my capacity as a learner as I am as a professor. I had the opportunity to meet Rejo on Twitter, right? It was first on Twitter, and and Rejo was like, "Let's talk about Chicana feminism and game design," and I was like, "Yes." And also, maybe let's start to build a community of people who get to hear and think about these ideas. So I'm really looking forward to today's conversation. Rejo, over to you.
I'm actually looking forward to this as well. My name is Rejo Reta. They, them. I am currently just an independent scholar, but I have recently graduated with a master's in independent studies, focusing on my original interests, which were political science and history, and that kind of dovetailed into a lot of like Mexican American studies, which then twisted into Chicana feminism and gender studies. And as I was going through that, I found a lot of similarities with how gaming can be conceived, and it kind of turned into an obsession of mine. So yeah, I'm super stoked to be here and to gush about all of this.
Good. Okay. Well, let me prime the pump by saying, Chicana feminism is obviously a large topic all by itself. So, our viewers, probably have different levels of background and understanding of the field. What is the thing about Chicana feminism that most lights you up when you're thinking about it in relation to games?
I think, as with most people who kind of get into the field of Chicana feminism, we kind of get started with Gloria Anzaldúa, right? She's the mother of a lot of this work. She's also someone who grew up and lived in the same area that I actually grew up and lived in, so that's also kind of heartwarming. But very early on in her career, like early to mid 80s, she started doing a lot of writing, and she kind of configured this idea of border studies not just being like geographic or political borders, but it's the social and cultural and ideological borders that also help create identity, right? Like it helps discern what us and like we and others are, right? And she did it specifically because she was a queer brown woman who grew up at the border between Texas and Mexico, and all those things collided, and the way she said it, it caused a lot of remolinos in her, which are whirlwinds, which are confusing states within her, right? And again, since I grew up in the same area and I'm also a queer brown person, it really connected, right? And so the thing with her is that borders, as she conceives them, are the things that help create a third space, a third version of the binary, right? Or like an interstitial state is what she uses in some of her writing. And frankly, I think that's the most intriguing thing, right? Like where along the two kind of like solid states, something else is created, right? Something else becomes a new factor or a new thing, personality wise, culturally, all that. And frankly, I think, at least when I was reading that, some of that can actually be translated over into gaming, right? Because the game table, virtually or otherwise, the active play is creating a third state. It is creating a border where the reality of the person is intermingling with the reality of the play, the imaginary persona that they're putting on, and it's creating something new, right? The bleed, right? As we kind of conceive of it, is forming together a new state for both the person and the character, right? Because there's never going to be kind of like an isolation between the two, right? Both are going to feed each other, and both are going to create something new.
So it sounds almost, so when I hear that, right, I start putting into context of like previous work on the magic circle and the way that play is outside of and separated from everyday life. And there's been work showing that things pass back and forth across that boundary all the time, right? Like we're still, one of the things that I like to say is like, we're still when we play, we're still ourselves. We're still present. Like, right. It's not like, absolutely. It's not an either or. And it sounds like what you're really pushing for is the idea of that both and state, that it's not about crossing the border. It's actually about living in the border, like being in that liminality.
Absolutely. And that's the pretty much the core of what she's saying, right? One of the big concepts in her first kind of solo book, Borderlands, or La Frontera. I don't know why I'm stumbling there. I'm sorry. But
and I'm sorry, just for our readers, that's that's Borderlands.
Borderlands.
And in Spanish, it is
La Frontera.
La Frontera.
Yeah.
Okay. Go on.
So the thing that she kind of hinges a lot of her work there on is the idea of a mestiza consciousness, right? Mestizas are specifically women who are the intermingling of heritages of Spanish and indigenous Mexican identities. And she shifts it over and makes it more specifically about those who live on the Texas-Mexican border, because she's theorizing from her own experiences. But she says that from there, the mestiza has a consciousness to live within those two states. Right, the fact that they have to experience both the American and the Mexican side of culture, and across all its different varieties, it creates a new being that allows them to see other things from other perspectives. I guess is probably the best way to put it. Right, and same thing happens when it's like if for her case, if she's a lesbian. She has to see things differently from the heteronormative point of view, right? That's imposed on her, but it's not her. So she has to find a way to navigate and kind of remap both herself and the culture that she's living in because of the way the two conflict, but also mesh together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And
please.
Oh, I was going to say, and yeah, the same thing happens with, it's basically Bleed, right? The same thing happens when you're say you're going to play a long campaign or something. You're going to bring in a portion of yourself, something that you want to see into the character that you're creating, and then hopefully explore that in play.
Right. Well, I think something that, and you have to tell me if this is a piece of what you're talking about, but what I'm hearing is that you're talking about that you're at once a person with this like resonant and deep identity, and when you cross into play, you can play with different pieces of the identity, but it's also about the way that you contrast with the dominant norms of the society around you.
Absolutely.
And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how we create fictional spaces that might resist or counteract those norms. For example, what if we, what happens if we start playing games that are homonormative rather than heteronormative, or that are binormative, right? Or games where, like, how can that work with this idea of shifting our identities?
That's actually going to be the same sort of idea, right? Like, you're going to have to place yourself within the narrative that's being told, and then have to find a way that your current perspective can still, I was going to say conflict with, that's not necessarily it, but find a way to how it actually crosses into that new normativity, right? I'm not sure if it's necessarily controversial, but I do think that for most cases, unless you're very deep into this, like most people are willing to, even if you're very, very straight, you're willing to concede the attractiveness of someone who's the same gender as you, right? whether out of jealousy or whatever, right? And maybe using that as a path, right? Another thing that Anzaldúa talks about is bridging, right? Finding a bridge between both ends, right? So like if you're someone who's very staunchly into the heteronormative space and has to find a way to cross over into the new fictional like homo normativity, you have to find something within yourself that lets you cross over. You have to find that bridge. You have to find that space that exists somewhere in you that lets you connect with it. Lets you see that new perspective. Yeah.
Right. So, and that could happen at the level of the character, right? This is a character who is not like me, but I'm finding an echo of myself that allows me to connect to them. Or it could be I'm experiencing a world where I experience friction in places where I don't experience friction in my everyday life.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that idea of friction with sort of the dominant culture is really powerful, because it is a way of seeing, right? It's a way of making things visible that to people who have this dominant perspective, it is invisible.
Right.
And I think this is where a lot of people get lost, for example, in conversations about privilege, right? They kind of see it as, oh, well, my privileges, as opposed to thinking about it like, what are the defaults and the norms? Like, what are what do I not see because I'm looking through my eyes instead of I'm looking through someone else's eyes?
Right. They're existing in the, I think Bonilla Silva calls it the white habitus, right?
Yep.
The white construction of society, right? Like, are you willing to step outside of that just for a moment and see something else, right? Yeah.
That's right. And, and I think that, what's really interesting is that as I grow and mature and learn about the world, which is a process that will never stop until the day I die.
We can talk about that too. Sorry.
Yeah, I find myself sort of more and more understanding what I don't know, and even really seeing my own experience differently. So. One of the things that has really, I am an observant Jew, and one of the things that my engagement with racial justice has actually taught me is that, like, maybe I can expect better than the constant challenge of existing in a hegemonic Christian society.
Right.
And that was actually a weirdly painful experience, because when you're used to, I come from a Holocaust family, and we were sort of, you're sort of used to the idea, don't make trouble, don't expect too much, and maybe you won't get murdered. Right. And being around people whose expectations for themselves and their communities were so much higher was really powerful for me on a personal level. But it also really, I really had to learn to tolerate discomfort. That in some ways it was easier for me to see injustice that was happening to other people than to say, oh, and actually every day of my life is kind of just a little bit uncomfortable because I live in this Christian normative society that would frankly like me to be assimilated or dead.
Right. Yeah.
And that's just like, that sucks, right? Like I don't want to live with that. But that's the reality. And so and games can be a way to confront that reality.
Absolutely. And when you mentioned the difficulties that you face in that sort of situation, it actually dove right into the other concept from Anzaldúa that I love and adore, which is Nepantla, right? Nepantla is a Nahua, which is Aztec, I guess, term for the in-between. Typically, it's the space between one place and another, right? Yep. And again, you have that, right? The binary and the thing that happens in the middle of that. And for her, Nepantla is the space where a person confronts the kind of antagonistic or oppressive forces that are put on them, and they have to, again, navigate that space. They have to figure out, like, well, what about this hurts? What can I remove from it? What can I take away and kind of incorporate into myself, right? What can I do to rid myself of the remolino, right? The whirlwind that's within me because of this kind of overarching structure, and make myself a better person. Right. And again, going back to gaming, that can be also how a person plays the game, right? as a non-binary person who is right now in a year-long game with an all-trans group, which is a blessing. Oh my god! But we've all discussed how much the ability to kind of just choose the gender that you want, right, or not have any gender is freeing, right? Like it's the ability to say, okay, there's this one sticking point in reality that I want to need around in my hands for right now, right? And what can I do about it? And normally, as I kind of alluded to when I started discussing Nippon, it's a kind of traumatic state,
Yeah.
right? It's like you said, like you feel that weight, that low grade terror of existence, right? Normally that's what it's supposed to be, but with gaming, it's kind of not that, right? With gaming, you get to choose what you want to mess with, right? It's something that you get to test out on your own in a hopefully safe space with other people around you to help you inform and also get their hands on that masa, which is like the dough, right? Get their hands in there and help you create something else, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's a beautiful thing, and frankly, something that probably should be done a lot more often in society outside of games than anything else. But
Yeah.
that's a whole other topic.
So talk to me about the other people at the table, because what you're talking about is a communal experience, and you're saying that you can choose, and you can choose your identity, and you can control whether or not you're safe. But obviously, I think we've all heard stories of people just treating each other badly as human beings in the context of a game. So how do you bring a group together that's ready to do this kind of deep self-reflection and exploration and identity work? What do you suggest? How do you do that?
Play a lot of games. Play a lot of tables specifically, right? Play with a lot of people. Like the my old group, which is very cis-oriented. I love them. They're all my dear friends. But there's issues that can be glossed over or introduced in those sorts of cases, and it's good because I'm okay with that. Like I'm willing to accept all that and kind of navigate those spaces generally on my own, right?
Mm-hmm.
But when I reached out to the current group, that's actually kind of a conglomeration of other groups that have filtered out I won't say toxic because they weren't all necessarily toxic, but the people who were maybe unwilling to touch or even broach on these subjects, right?
Right.
So that's great. I mostly GM, unfortunately. So, but the other few times that I've been able to play over the last decade, which has honestly been a handful of times, but it's been with tables that they've been questionable, but not bad, right? Maybe. Sorry.
Please go on.
Oh,
I said right.
Oh yeah.
I know exactly what you mean, right? Like, good people, well-intentioned, not necessarily the right dynamic.
Right. Yeah, they sometimes maybe have certain concepts of people or things or cultures that not necessarily terrible, not necessarily the best, right? And that's fine. That's good. It's a growing experience. Of course, if you don't want to experience that, definitely don't. But just play with what you can, who you can. Find out those people that are willing to get into those same spaces with you. Definitely look at the games that you want to play. Because one thing I've noticed is that, not a knock on D&D, right? But D&D has a very specific sort of mindset for a lot of players, right? And you might not necessarily find a completely work-worthy group for you, right? Stuff like more independent games, or specifically, I've been obsessed with Powered by the Apocalypse games for a while. So, like, people who are willing to accept the structure of those games and the kind of nebulousness of some of the way the game asks you to kind of involve yourself in. I think that's really empowering, right? Like if you find those groups and everyone's willing to just completely accept the game for what it is, like it's a beautiful, beautiful thing.
Yeah. So it sounds like you're saying that there are two key pieces when you're sort of filtering for these groups. Is one, that you want people you can be vulnerable with. And that is not something that you can just know from what someone says, or even necessarily from how they are outside the gaming table. Right? Yeah. So, for example, I have a wonderful colleague who I was like, oh, we're going to play games together. It's going to be fabulous. And his partner was like, no, don't. He turns into a giant troll at the game table. And I was like, but you're so kind and like sweet. And like, you're just like an incredibly like virtuous and like good person. Okay, maybe we won't do that, right? So I think this idea of like taste testing, like doing a little bit of gaming with people and finding out who you can be vulnerable with is really important. And who wants to do that work. Different people use games for different things.
Yeah.
And actually the same people use games for different things at different age, right? Different points in their lives. Yeah. But I think that the other really powerful thing, and I'm sorry, I just want to put a pin in this. You mentioned Powered by the Apocalypse games. I'm going to ask you to recommend a couple games to our viewers because not everybody here is familiar with role-playing games. But first, I just want to say, I think that the other thing is that there's a certain amount of like baseline shared knowledge that you want people to be doing, to have. Like this is that could be a lot or a little. Could be about one aspect of identity or several, but that you all want to come in kind of knowing where you're starting and knowing what's taken for granted in the group when you're doing this kind of identity work.
Right. Yeah. And that's why the discussion of session 0, that's kind of become the norm over the last few years, right? Where everyone takes at least a couple of hours before you actually start play to create characters, to agree on what sort of setting you want, how you want to approach that setting, and the stories that you tell. It's super vital, right? Yeah. Even if it's a group that you've played with forever, right? It's good to say like, hey, here's what we all want to agree on, right? And here's what we know to expect from each other, right? Because like you said, people play differently on different days sometimes, right? Like, so having a document, or at least unwritten social contract where it's like, okay, cool, like we know if you've had a bad day, right, and you might want to take a lot of stress out, don't do certain things here, right? Don't cross these lines, because we all agreed well beforehand these lines are set, right? Do not just do not touch that.
Makes sense.
Enthusiastic narrator question on that front.
Yes.
If you're playing games that have the potential to be transformative, it is possible for someone to transform in a way that they no longer vibe with the group or where their needs change. Can you talk about your recalibration tools and how you check in and what you do at the table or between sessions to make sure that the contract that you've reached in the beginning still suits all of your players?
Yeah, that's actually a great subject because one of the things that I've adopted the last few years is the kind of like end of session debrief, right? Where it's like just do the check-ins, right? Stars and Wishes is one that I've kind of adopted over the last year, where it's like, hey, what was a highlight? What's something that you want to see? And that's a really good way to just gauge the like in the moment interest of the players, right? But the other thing that I've done actually for a while now, probably 15 years, is every few months, if it's a long-term campaign, right? Every few months, say 4 to 5 months, just broach the subject with individuals and as a group. Just like, how do you feel? Is everything okay? Is there anything you want to see? Is there something that you thought you wanted to see and kind of don't like feel anymore? It's a good way to just say like, hey, this is a space for you to back out if you want, right? Or if it's like D&D or something, like just create a new character, right? Like if you've explored everything that you wanted to explore with this character, either mechanically or narratively, it's okay to just back away, do something different, or just step away from the table completely, right? I think it's a really, really interesting thing to do because, again, in a lot of, I don't say normative games because that sounds, but you can't necessarily do that with video games. You just stop playing, right? Like there's no real resolution to what's happening there. but with RPGs, or specifically kind of like tabletop RPGs, there is an ability for you to resolve something before you actually end it. Right? You actually get to say, like, well, you know what? I do want to retire this character right now. Let me just do a little bit more. Right? Let me wrap up some of the storylines and then just move that character away. Right? And I honestly, I think that's one of the best things that you can do as a player, right? Because again, just leaving something out in the open always feels terrible, right? I'm sure a lot of people have regrets when a campaign ends, kind of like all of a sudden, or when a game just doesn't vibe with you, right? Like there's that that rock that kind of sits in your stomach a little bit, that kind of like piles on as you play more games, where it's like, oh, this could have gone differently, and you know, I wish it had, right? And yeah, being able to give people that ability to resolve themselves in a way is brilliant, perfect, really.
So it sounds like what you're saying is that, you know, part of the key here with doing this work is actually that you have this ongoing campaign. And for those watching along, if you're not so familiar with tabletop role-playing games, every time you get together to play, that's a session. And at the end of the session, Rejo has a bunch of tactics and techniques. And but that the ability to have these long-term relationships where trust is deepening and you're actually able to like track your learning over time and your experience over time, that's something that you're not going to do in a one-off or in, you know, a 3-session game. Yeah. And professionally, I think that's really interesting to me, because in a lot of educational games, you know, that's part of I work on educational and transformational games, and especially games that are meant to be used in the classroom. It's like, all right, have the whole experience. You know, it's like you'll have 2 45-minute sessions and then you wrap it up. Or, if you're lucky, you might get like a full, you know, a 1 to 2 day experience where you're getting to do, you know, like a big like live action event, or, you know, some kind of big gaming event. But the idea of these long-term relationships, I mean, what's the longest campaign you've ever had, Rejo?
So it was actually I regret it now, sort of, but it was a 3rd edition or 3.5 edition D&D game, which went from 2000, like early 2003, I think, to late 2008, and it was
5 years.
Which I guess is not huge, because I've heard of people who have like 30-year long campaigns, whatever, but I don't like that. That sounds so limiting, and again, just personally, I buy tons of games and I want to play tons of games, and sticking to one campaign is it's a hazard.
Right. But 5 years of playing with the same people once a week.
Yeah.
That's a serious relationship.
It is. And
you know,
I think there was maybe one character death throughout the entire thing. Right.
So people are still working through the same character, the same lens of being in that fictional world. That's really powerful. So I know you've mentioned that, you know, D&D may not be the best game for people to try this kind of work, and that makes sense to me, right? You're talking about game literacy, that people come in with preconceptions about what D&D is like, and you may need to kind of get around those. Yeah. What are some of the games you most recommend our viewers should try?
So again, just because I'm here in the moment and have been for a bit, Powered by the Apocalypse games, as I mentioned before, I think are all very, very strong in letting a player know what is expected of them, right? And what they can do within that space, right?
If they were going to look at just one game, right? Because everyone here has limited time. What should the one game they look at be? I know I'm putting you on the spot.
Oh, yeah. That's fine. Mileage may vary because it depends on what genre you like. But I personally would recommend Masks. Masks is a teenage superhero game where the importance of your social relationships with everybody else and with everyone in the team, and then other people around you in your like NPC or GM character space is more important than fighting a big bad evil guy, right? Like, it's not, you have villains, you can definitely deal with villains, but the idea is like what do you as a player have to deal with, suffer with, overcome in order to tell your story.
Yeah. Well, and the superhero genre actually sounds really meaningful and appropriate for this kind of work because, of course, superheroes are also people who have secret identities, right? So there's this layer of like identity work in the fiction and also out of the fiction, right?
Absolutely.
So it becomes this like microcosm of maybe some of these bigger questions.
And the biggest mechanic really in that game is your relationships with other people. It could be that team members have influence over you, because influence is how they measure it, right? If a team member has influence over you, they can use that to help you or to tell you to do something, right? And that can then impact your scores, right? How you view yourself, whether or not you think you're a freak or a general hero or very mundane, because your scores are also not like strength and dexterity or whatever. It's they're aspects of yourself, right? So if someone uses their influence on you, they could say like, well, hey, tone it down. Don't be such a overly destructive walking warhead or whatever. So your mundane goes up. Right. And that's really interesting because, again, it's the idea of like, well, and you can also reject that influence, right? But that has other impacts on you. So it's like, okay, well, fine. Like, what about my personality am I willing to let other people dictate?
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and that also seems like a really powerful analogy for what it means to have any kind of marginalized identity in a society that has these dominant norms along that axis, right? So it's like, to what extent are you going to be less like flamboyantly queer, right? To what extent are you going to be less feminine? To what extent are you going to be, whatever it is?
Right.
Yeah, and that's really powerful. Is maybe helping you think through some of the strategies that you can use to do that, like. I don't know if you've ever thought to yourself, wow, that person is really trying to make me more mundane right now. But I at least can, I can think of analogies in my own life, right? It's people have literally said, don't talk, don't make so much noise, be quiet, right?
Yeah, exactly, yeah. And kind of going back to Anzaldúa, in one of her essays, she talks about masks and interstices, right? Where like everybody has a mask of a thing that's expected of them. Right. So like if you're a wife and a mother, you have the wife mask, the mother mask. But if you're also a working woman, you have the mask of the worker. Right. If you're a marginalized woman, you have the mask of whatever race you are. Right. And the whole thing with her is that's fine. Not fine, but like that's an understandable thing to occur. But there's still the core of yourself that's hidden behind those masks and eventually leaks out between the interstices of each of those. Yeah. Right, like, and that ends up melding the masks together into the new personality of yourself. Right? So,
what does she think is the thing that's behind the masks? Like, what does she conceptualize as that core identity of who you are?
The way she speaks about it for herself, because again, all of her theory is almost like very metaphorized from her own experience as a queer woman. She talks about it as a snake. Right. For one, snakes are very important to indigenous Mexican culture, but also in South Texas, where both of us grew up. Snakes are fairly common out in the boondocks and El Monte, right? So you see them a lot, and for her, that snake is the thing that is supposed to be her, and the thing that, again, for her, pushes back against society. The thing that society doesn't necessarily like. Right. Because it is a poisonous creature that can harm you or whatever. But it's held within you. And again, with a lot of her metaphors, there are points where that snake just comes out, where there's no other way to hold it within yourself other than just splitting open and letting the snake exhibit itself for a little bit. And then you get to the Nepantla state, right? Like you get to the point where like, well, the snake is out here. What do I do with the snake right now? Like how do I handle this?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. That's really powerful. So that there are things in you that will never fit roles that you're expected to fill.
Yeah.
And actually that might look different, right? Depending on what roles are put on you. That, maybe there are ways to channel that through some of your roles, but then you can imagine that the snake looks different, right? That there are other pieces of you that then can't be channeled or aren't acceptable.
Oh my God! So I love this. Okay, so going back to one of the earlier things you said when you were talking about kind of like what you feel in like white Christian normative society, and what you just said right now about having other pieces are also things that she talks about, right? So I'll touch.
Amazing. So let's just be clear. I'm going to go read Borderlands after this conversation, and so should you, viewers. Read it too.
Borderlands and her other, unfortunately, posthumous work. I'm taking it off my pile. Light in the Dark, which
Light in the Dark. Okay,
Light
great.
in the Dark. Two wonderful works of theory and just personal essayship, really.
Yeah.
But specifically in Light in the Dark, one of the things that she talks about, she mentions it in Borderlands, but is Koyushauki. Koyushauki is Mexica or Aztec goddess of the moon that in the mythology was ripped apart by her brothers. Right. She basically had it out for their mom, and the brothers were like, well, no, we can't let you do this. So they just tear her apart and throw her down the mountain. So she's at the bottom, just limbs and intestines, all the gory stuff. Right. Yeah. And the thing about Koyushauki is that she's meant to put herself back together at some point. Right. She's meant to become the full moon, basically. She's meant to be the entirety of herself one way or another. And Anzaldúa actually takes that and says, like, that's what a person is, right? A person is torn apart by society, right? And they have to figure out a way to get those pieces back together. And yes, there are points where sometimes those pieces don't fit anymore. Sometimes those pieces are not something that you identify with anymore. Sometimes those pieces are just extraneous now, right? They're like, maybe they never served any purpose, so you can let go. And
that's interesting.
And the thing with her is that especially in Light in the Dark, there is this concept of conocimiento, which is just like recognizing yourself, understanding yourself, right? And there are several steps in conocimiento, which is basically part of it, Nepantla, right? Like you exist, society rips you up, right? Tells you what to do, tells you what you are. You try and organize that within yourself, and as the steps go on, it's basically like you come out of that process as something else, something new. But it's not a finalized state. You have that in yourself. Society's then going to reflect back on that, tear you apart.
Right.
You have to come back and put yourself together with something new. Society, that whole thing. And yeah, it's that, right? You mentioned it before, right? Like you're always going to be learning. You're always going to be adjusting yourself to the thing that you want to be.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Well, and this idea that like the tearing and the healing is actually part of a natural process, right? My sense is that she's not saying that it's bad to have a society. Like, no, yeah. It's just that society needs things from you that are different from what you need for yourself.
Exactly. Yeah. And at some point you have to resolve that, right? Like, do you want to acknowledge society and what it wants, or do you want to affirm yourself? In both cases, there's something good out of it, right? Also in Light in the Dark, she talks about spiritual activism, right? Where it's like you've recognized yourself and your place in society so much that you're willing to, at that point, go out and reflect that onto society and hope society changes.
Yeah.
Right. And I've discussed this with a lot of people, and I always use the same example. So a few years ago, I was doing a lot of work, or volunteer work, at least at the public library, and running D&D and other RPGs for kids who are like preteen to teens, right? And one of the things that I always tried to do, and maybe it's indoctrination or whatever, but one of the things I always tried to do is give them social quandaries, right? Things to think about. Like, well, this is your character. What would they do? And what do you think about that? Right? Like, is the character doing what you want? Or have you built up your character enough that you know what they want and you may or may not agree with it, right?
Yeah.
And that's part of like spiritual activism, right? It's the idea of just, hey, think about these things that you want to see, right? And be able to express them to other people and to yourself in order for everything to grow around you.
That's so powerful. And I feel like now part of the reason I need to go and do this reading is because some of my professional work is actually drawing on this, but I don't didn't have the words or the tools to talk about it. So, for example, I worked with a group of students. We designed a game with a character who was dealing with anxiety, right? So, and the character would do things, but the point was that the player would have a conversation with. It was meant for teenagers, and the idea was that the players would then talk to their parents about the character as is a way of opening a conversation about their own mental health concerns.
Oh, that's good.
Right. So but it's what happens between the people, even though the game is being played on the screen.
Right.
So yeah, I would love to revisit that project at some point. We kind of, we took a semester, we built a demo, we worked with a clinician over at Pitt, and the project ended up going in a different direction. But that sounds like something where your deep theoretical expertise could immediately inform the design of not just tabletop role-playing games, right? Like, these like 5-year campaigns are impressive and amazing, but like hard to replicate,
Yeah.
if you kind of don't know what to do or can't train with someone like you who really knows what they're doing. But I can already see ways that this body of theory could be put into digital experiences that can be widely distributed, where the philosophy of understanding where you fit in society and reintegrating yourself in the face of society's demands, that's the conversation that's provoked by the game between players.
Yeah. And yeah, it's one of those things that, again, a lot of other like hobbies don't necessarily get close to, right? One of the things that Antadua actually does talk about is that art itself is this. Art is a way for the artist to evoke their nepantla, right? To work out their issues, then have a material object to show to an audience, and the audience hopefully takes out their own version of the nepantla from it, and then it keeps iterating on itself. And the thing that kind of stuck with me with RPGs, and kind of going back to the whole idea that you had with that game where the students go out and or go back to their parents and discuss it, is that there's not a lot of time where you get the immediate influence from the audience, right? I know Augusto Boal kind of talks about it when he talks about the theater of the oppressed, right? But it's still, there's still breaks.
And sorry, Theater of the Oppressed is the name of the book if you're looking for it on the right on the internet. Yes. Okay, there you go. Go on.
But yeah, there's still breaks there. There's still moments where the play stops, right? And then people have to reset themselves, like with RPGs and with the game that you were giving an example of right now, like. Not really, right? There's not a stoppage there. It's just a flow of that movement and that discussion from the active play to the incorporation to the kind of discourse in society, right? And again, that's super powerful for me, right? Because again, you don't get that with a lot of other art.
Right. Well, and I wonder if there are tools, right? So, of course, I'm in a computer science department. I'm trained as a designer and a computer scientist and a cognitive psychologist. So I kind of have these different lenses. It's what I like to call HCI the hard way. I didn't know that there was this interdisciplinary thing, so I just did all the pieces individually. Good job, past Jess. But actually, it's turned out great because I feel like I have a very different perspective because of it. But so one of the questions I'm always wondering is like, well, are there technologies or tools that you could use to sort of amplify these effects of these long-term campaigns? Like, I know people will do stuff like they'll have a campaign wiki, or they'll draw these elaborate materials for their characters, or now people are playing on Zoom and recording their sessions and going back and rewatching them. And of course you have this actual play movement where people are playing on camera and filmed for an audience. So I don't know what the answer is, but I kind of want to put this in your head is like, what do people need to do this experience sort of better? Or, is it something where it's really just about human skill, right? That maybe it doesn't even need paper and pen?
That's a good question. I won't say necessarily averse to technology. I'm just real bad with it. Unlucky with it is probably a really good description of it. But that's a really good question. Definitely, I think.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say definitely.
You're You.
I was just gonna say, like, allowing people to have like those spaces to express the things that they do like about the game, outside of even just like the check-ins that I was describing earlier, like having like the comment sections for like wikis open, or allowing them to make art and displaying it at the game, right? Allowing that interaction to kind of keep going is definitely a really good idea.
Yeah. Okay. I don't really have answers, but I think it would be, there's a small group of researchers who are working on these questions of how do we augment tabletop play, and especially tabletop role-playing games. I mean, there are other people who are working on tabletop board games and blah, blah, blah. Big field, lots of interesting questions. But I don't actually know if anybody is working on these kinds of long-term experiences. I know there are a lot of people who are doing like, let me create cool augmented technology for this like one-shot LARP. And then let's study how people use it and we can learn. Right. So I don't know. I mean, I almost feel like the next step might be to talk to people about what some of these experiences and long-term campaigns are.
Yeah.
I've got one paper. I did a participant observation in an Ars Magica game, looking at how people used history. Which, the TLDR of the paper, which I really enjoyed writing, was basically the players were going, "I hate history," while like spending their weekends at the library doing historical research so they could do better at the game. And I was just like, what the hell is going on here? But one of the things that they talked a lot about was the ability to document and record what happened, and that they sort of wanted a way to get like the highlights of things that had happened, but they didn't necessarily want to spend a ton of time after every session writing things up. Right. So I feel like if we talk to, people who play the way that you're interested in, I wonder what else we would learn that could inform things we could make for them, which, by the way, maybe don't involve a screen, right? Like a pen and paper. That's also a piece of technology. So
yeah, that rarely fails for me, thankfully. Actually, yeah. So one of the things that you brought up, the whole Ars Magica, like, I hate history, but I'm going to go like do history now. So when I was teaching a couple of courses last year, a lot of the students, intro to Mexican American Studies courses, right? And I went in with a lot of different like lenses and scopes that I wanted the students to kind of touch on. And before the pandemic ruined everything, a lot of the students had come in saying like, I don't know anything, right? It looks like an interesting course. I'll find out what I find out. And over the like 2.5 months that we actually had in-person classes, a lot of them actually got very invested in looking into their own personal family histories, looking into what is how these things kind of reflect on their own lives. And I think that's something that can maybe be touched on, right? I'm assuming that the Ars Magica players would look up the histories specific to their characters, like their regions and locales and classes.
Exactly.
And so yeah, finding a way to incorporate that, again, maybe without so much writing or something, and let the players' imaginations kind of flow outside of the game. I haven't played it yet. I have it, and it's a giant box, and I still haven't played it. But Money Cook Games is Invisible Sun, which very specifically wants players and GMs to play outside of the normal game session in little vignettes. I think something like that would be really interesting. And it's something that doesn't have to be done in person or online. One of the things that they like saying is you can just do it by text, right? Like all you're doing is supplementing the narrative, right? Just give yourself some moments to spew something out and let that like kind of like unfold into the larger narrative later. I think that would be, that's interesting.
Yeah. All right. Well, listen. Yeah, let's put that in the back of both our heads. This may be a to be continued. Let me turn to Abby and ask if there's any questions from the chat that we can address in our last 10 minutes.
There are not questions, so I thought maybe we could turn this to talk about how we use the concepts that you've talked about to create counter spaces and opportunity for exploration in academia.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I had originally planned for the last half of the semester last year when I was teaching is, I can't remember the author's name right now. I feel bad. But there was a La Malinche RPG that came out maybe 2 years ago. And La Malinche is a specifically Mexican American story about the first woman to, or supposedly the first woman to give birth to a mestizo child, right? Someone who was both Spanish and indigenous.
Yeah.
And Mexican culture unfortunately demonizes her for it, saying like she led to the impurities of everything. But meanwhile, all of Mexico is a mix of everything. Anyways, it's a giant gross mess. But either way, they're blaming women for stuff. And the thing about this RPG is it's very specifically asking you to create a version of La Malinche in different time periods, right? Like, what is this woman who has been abused both by her partner and by society? What does it look like in these different spaces? And it's always embodied by one person at the table. Everybody else plays kind of like a Greek chorus, right? And their questions and answers to the things that La Malinche puts forward drive the narrative a little bit more forward. And I had originally planned to do that at the end of every week in those classes, specifically using the eras that we were talking about, right? Where we can say, okay, what do you envision La Malinche to be in like 1920s United States in like the Southwest, right? Like, what would she be facing? What are the questions that would be asked of her? What are the traumas that she's undergoing, right? And how does she resolve them, right? I desperately wanted to do that, and I hope I get back to teaching because, man, I want to use that. And yeah, again, it's allowing them to both think about the topics critically, but also use that imagination to insert themselves and their own opinions and their own faculties into the idea.
Was that the game by Kazumi?
Yes, that's right.
I'm going to drop the link into the chat.
Okay.
Thank you, Abby.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I guess from my point of view, I want to uplift the work of my PhD student, Erica Cruz, who's working on counter spaces within academia, but also within other kinds of, I think the work is going to be extended to other kinds of organizations as well. And, I think that one of the key things that she's really drawn out about this space is that play is an opportunity for people to be countercultural because it helps you see the cultural norms and it gives you a way to resist them without necessarily putting yourself in direct confrontation with the dominant culture. So in academia, she and I, with my student, former student, now a professor, Alexandra Toe, wrote a paper called Lab Counterculture, which was trying to expose some of these cultural norms in academia, like quantification of everything, right? How many papers did you write? How many points did you get on the assignment, right? At the expense of other ways of knowing, creating competition for resources, right? I'm only allowed to give a certain number of A's in this class, or, So, talking about helping people see those in the way that having a sort of a marginalized identity can help you see the invisible systems that are set up in dominant culture, right, that are invisible to the people for whom they are working. And exposing those and helping people design against them has been really useful and productive. So I actually led a session for our incoming PhD students yesterday, where one of the things we did is we talked about some of the pressures and incentives that are on them to overwork and, not take care of themselves, not do the things that they need to do to be whole human beings instead of research machines. And I kind of, and I said to them, there are real reasons you feel this way, right? And we can't change all of academic culture, but what we can do is we can bring these things into the light, and we can start to look at ways that at different levels, people with different amounts of power can resist, right? So some of these things might be things that you have to do for yourself. Like, I'm not going to come into your house and stop you from sending email at 2 a.m. Some of these are things that you can only do collectively. So we talked about, for example, how it's easy to set off like an arms race for achievement among people, right? Like among students. Like, oh, I published 3 papers. Well, I published 5 papers. Well, I mean, that's nice. It doesn't make you a better person. So we talked about how as a community they could develop other ways of valuing each other, right? So maybe the collective value they agree to have is we value people for their contributions to the community, or we value people for their adherence to their values, right? And some of these things can only really be addressed structurally or systemically, right? So we talked about what I can do. I actually am serving as the interim associate director of the department, which basically means I'm second in command during a leadership transition. And so, like, I have some power to do stuff. What are the things that I can do because I have access to parts of the system that they don't, and what needs to be done at the CMU level, what needs to be done in the field, and where do we start, where do we stand? What we've talked about today has given me a really powerful framework for having these conversations with students, right? That the goal of exposing these systems is actually to make them uncomfortable. Like, their job is not to either see them in despair or to see them and say, okay, well, I'll just do that, right? It's to live in that liminal space, right? That Alan Dua talks about, that you both see it, right? And you recognize that that is the society, the system within which you're living. Like, I don't tell my students, well, forget publishing, it's not important, like, that's one of the ways you'll be judged if you want to go and be a professor. But at the same time, we can think about, how do we make these norms less normal and less comfortable so that we can make space for the snake, right? For the parts of us that aren't welcomed or acknowledged by those systems. Things like, maybe I'm going to publish one less paper, but I'm going to do my research in a slower and more community engaged way, right? Like, those are trade-offs that people, that the more that we can make that liminal space, the more that I think people are going to feel safe and comfortable making choices like that, instead of just kind of doing what the sometimes broken norms of the system tell them to do.
Right. All the supposedly qualified work that is expected of you. Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly.
That's good.
All right. I think maybe that's the note where we're going to end, because we're at time. Rejo, this has been an incredible conversation. If people want to follow up with you and learn more from you, what's the best way for them to do it?
I guess Twitter. I don't know. You can follow me at Rejo1479. I don't interact too often there. It's mostly me just retweeting things that make me angry. But my DMs are open, I believe, so that's fine. You can do that. You can. Yeah, that's probably the best.
Okay, great. You can find me. My personal account is Cleanystar on Twitter, KLEENESTAR, you can find my scholarly work on Google Scholar. Just search for Jessica Hammer. I have a Google Scholar page, and most of my papers are available for download if you're curious about what I do. And with that, I'll turn back over to you for the outro, Avi. Thank you both for a fantastic hour.
Thank you.